Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today on this last but not least day of Black History Month. As Jermaine said, my name is Kim Toya Williams. I am the chairperson of the People of African Descent Affinity Group, and we are honored to host today's event for the Church Pension Group. The esteemed panelists with us today are the Right Reverend Dr. Nathan Baxter. He's the Senior Adjunct Professor of Practice at Lancaster Theological Seminary. We also have Patricia Favreau, the Executive Vice President and Chief Communication Officer with the Church Pension Group. Also with us, the Reverend Glenna Huber, Rector at the Church of the Epiphany in Washington, D.C. We have the Honorable Byron Rushing, Vice President of the House of Deputies of the Episcopal Church. And we have the Very Reverend Sandye Wilson, Dean at the Cathedral Church of All Saints in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. She is a member of the Church Pension Fund Board of Trustees. And now for our opening prayer, I warmly introduce you to the Reverend Canon Ann Maloney, CPG's Executive Vice President and Chief Ecclesiastical Officer.
Thank you, Kim Toya, and thank you all who have joined today for this important conversation. Let us pray. Dear God, thank you for this time together and for the technology that makes it possible to gather. Please bless this event, that it both inform and inspire and bring into sharp focus a vision of beloved community for the Episcopal Church. We give thanks for our panelists, for their willingness to tell their stories. May they be bold, for justice is possible only with truth. May the ears of our hearts be open to listen, to hear, to transform us, to equip us, that we may live in love as you have intended from the very beginning for all people. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Ann. We're going to start with Vice President Rushing. As someone who has served the church for nearly 50 years, how would you define beloved community? And what progress have you seen around the church in general, and specifically around General Convention?
For me, beloved community is the understanding of everyone in whatever community we are in as being respected people, as being people who are cared for and who are allowed to care for each other. As Martin Luther King used to put it, that he saw it as a network of mutuality, and that whatever affects any one of us indirectly affects us all directly, and whatever affects us directly, we have to assume is also affecting others. As many of us in this COVID pandemic learned when we were children, when white people catch a cold, Black people get pneumonia. Now, in a beloved community, all the white people would know that too, would have been taught that also.
Thank you. Thank you. Bishop Baxter, you've also served the church at different levels over your long tenure. What strides around racial reconciliation under the leadership of Bishop Curry can you point to as progress, and or what challenges do you face?
We are so blessed to have the presence and ministry of our presiding bishop, Michael Curry. Those of us who have known him for many years really see how his many gifts, and not only his powerful preaching, but his powerful preaching is so influenced by his pastoral spirit. I believe that a part of the progress that we are making can be seen in accepting Bishop Curry for who he is. Someone who is authentically formed and shaped in the Black experience, whose charism as a preacher and as someone who is very passionate about community is really accepted without question. And I think that that is so important. He has earned that. It is not some magic stamp that has happened. I think it is important to note that he has pulled around him some wonderful staff members, Black and white. And one of the key things they have done is to focus on the beloved community. The term that is used, and you can see it on the National Church website, becoming the beloved community. And it has given us structured ways at the local level as well as at the diocesan level to learn to be in respectful conversation, ways in which we listen to each other, and ways also that we understand that it does not have to be perfect in the sense that we all understand everything about one another's story, but that we enter in with an openness. And I think that openness comes out of seeing how open he is and his passion, not only for the Black and white experience, that's very important for him, but also all the other ways in which we are divided. He welcomes us into that gift of love, that gift of respecting and caring for one another.
Thank you, Bishop Baxter. Um, let's turn to Mother Glenna. As rector of the Church of the Epiphany in Washington, D.C., how would you say the values and ministries of your parish community align with the vision of beloved community? And what are you all doing to move toward racial reconciliation?
Thank you for the question. The first thing I would say is the Church of the Epiphany is located in downtown DC, situated on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. It was founded in 1842. One of the congregants was Jefferson Davis. So the church was understood to be a Southern sympathizing church. Until the late 1800s, when Edwin Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, bought Jefferson Davis's pew. And so this began a fundamental shift in how the Church of the Epiphany understood itself. And then from then on, it has been a church committed to justice, and for the past 25 to 30 years, deeply committed to addressing issues around chronic homelessness, and those experiencing deep poverty. The demographic of DC currently lends itself for those experiencing homelessness to be disproportionately Black men. And when they come to Epiphany, the services we offer, the opportunity to worship just as a regular person without anybody asking what your socioeconomic status is, we just respect the worth and dignity of everybody who comes into the church to worship, to receive services, to have breakfast. And it's the challenge, I think, and this isn't just for the community of Epiphany, but for all of us, is to unpack and then address the systemic issues that allow for those economic disparities, those food insecurities, those housing insecurities to be disproportionately Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And I hope that we continue to work on that.
Thank you. CPG's Patty Favreau, my next question is for you. What is the role that the church pension group plays in supporting beloved community? And what have we done to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Thank you, Kim Toya. It is wonderful to be participating in this event, to be sharing our voices with CPG employees and with others around the church. I'm going to just first give a little bit of context about who CPG is for those of you who may be less familiar with the Church Pension Group. The Church Pension Group is, we operate 3 lines of business in support of the church. We are the benefits provider for the church. We have a publishing company, Church Publishing, that supports the church, and we have a property and casualty company. At CPG, we spend a lot of time thinking about our purpose, exactly why we exist, and we describe that as being here to support the clergy and lay people of the Episcopal Church in their calling to spread the gospel. And we do that fully, wholeheartedly, in all the ways with all the gifts that we have at our disposal. So in terms of what CPG is doing itself to support Becoming Beloved Community and race reconciliation, we spend a lot of time listening. And listening can sound quite passive. I mean, it's always been described as this really passive exercise. But for CPG, it's been quite provocative and courageous, I would say. Under the leadership of the People of African Descent Affinity Group at CPG, we've had sessions on microaggressions to help people understand what racial bias feels like to those of us who experience it on a daily basis. And that was scary for some people at first to encounter, to hear, to create a forum for that. But we did that. And in doing that, we are getting a better understanding of what the experiences of people of color are at CPG, which is the first step to reconciliation. The first step is really understanding and listening to and speaking the truth, creating space for Black people, other people of color, other diverse people to share their experiences. So we are doing that as a community within CPG, but we are also going out around the church and doing that as well. Mary Kate spends a lot of time at different, Mary Kate Wald, who's the CEO, goes around the church and talks to different groups about what their experiences are as women, as non-binary people, as people of color. And that is helping inform how we serve, how we educate, and the information we share with the church. So the first thing we do is we listen. The second thing we do, and this is in collaboration with General Convention and Executive Council, is we are monitoring and measuring where we are to help the church understand its truth and to know our own truth. So we have spent the better part of the last triennium collecting data on diverse clergy around the church to understand how many we are and how many diverse clergy we have present, but also to map it back to compensation, to see if we can help the church understand where parity exists and where there is disparity. And we're going to be sharing that information with the Episcopal Church in advance of General Convention and hopefully at General Convention this year. We also do a lot of monitoring within CPG to make sure that we are walking our talk, that we are as diverse as we hope the world to be. So that is the second area of activity. The third area is we are trying to help close the wealth gap. We know, because we do a lot of pension administration and we help people with savings, that there is a difference between the way Black clergy save for retirement and white clergy save for retirement. And so our education and wellness group is making a concerted effort, going the extra mile to do affinity-based credos, affinity-based educational programs, so that people of color around the church understand that we are here to serve everyone. We are here to help people of color too, and to help people of color understand, get access to the retirement savings platforms and education they need to thrive and live with dignity, not only while they are serving the church actively, but once they retire.
Thank you, Patty. Dean Sandye, my next question is for you. The Episcopal Church aspires to foster beloved communities where all people can experience dignity and abundant life and see themselves and others as beloved children of God. Would you tell us what beloved community means to you, your ministry, and the Church Pension Fund Board of Trustees?
No, I believe strongly that as Martin King brought this concept alive to us, that we are intentional as community. I think that word aspire in your question is very important, because as a church, we do want to get there. But the reality is that we are not yet there, and that this is kind of an eschatological reality. We have the contours of what beloved community is, but we have not yet arrived. My ministry has been about intentionally being in the midst of people different than myself. I've served all sorts of conditions of congregations, small ones, large ones, Black ones, white ones, mixed ones, East Coast, Midwest, West Coast, on purpose to understand who we are as the people of God gathered together, recognizing that we are people of story. And if we don't connect our story with one another's story and with God's story, then as Howard Thurman would say, life will never forgive us for it. We talk about people not really understanding us, but we also have got to enter the stories of other people so that we can have the kinds of courageous conversations that have to happen, maintaining a spirit of unity in a bond of peace. And if we are able to do that, then we can begin to imagine and live into that to which our presiding bishop has called us, which is love. But we can't get there by cheap grace. We have to be able to do the work. And we are, the beloved community is not an accidental crew of people who happen to worship in the same church or work in the same building. It is people who intentionally decide that they want to make the world a better place and that they really want to be in relationship. And on the Church Pension Fund Board of Trustees, we're working hard to have those kinds of conversations, to walk our talk, to engage in investments that really do reflect our commitment to transforming the world. Investments that are not just the normal straight white male investments that you would expect, but ones that really are intentional, looking at housing equity, looking at food scarcity, looking at the things that will give life to people, while also protecting the asset that is ours, so that there can be a fund into the future. Beloved community requires that we live into our values, and we've all spoken about truth, and truth pressed to the ground will rise again. But as it says in Ephesians, we must speak the truth in love. Love without truth does not exist, and truth without love is abusive. And so what I'd say we are trying to do as a board is live into our core values of professionalism, compassion, and trustworthiness. And that if we can do that, and the church can understand that they can count on us for that, then we can move through the kinds of things that we have to get through in order to get to love. Love is, as Kelly Brown Douglas says, love is a manger kind of thing. It goes from the hardwood of the manger to the hardwood of the cross. And it is not easy, but I'm convinced that committed to one another, we pray, get there.
Indeed. I am going to turn to a question that was submitted in the
Victoria,
Q&A channel.
Can I jump in here for
Sure.
a second? I'm sorry if I'm interrupting your flow, but I just wanted to piggyback on what Sandye just said, because we did get a question about investments, and she mentioned the work of the board. And the question we received was something like, what do we do to make sure our investments are promoting housing equity and not gentrification? And so I just wanted to call out one particular investment. First of all, the way that we invest through outside investors, and we spend a lot of time developing really strong relationships with outside managers. We know who these people are by the time we decide we're going to invest in them. We know what their values are. We know what their promises in terms of returns are. And so one investment that we made is with this organization called Avanath. There are videos on our website, and the principal participated in a recent Insights and Ideas event. But Avanath invests in housing equity. And I thought that was just a direct response to what Sandye was describing and to this question, because When you look at Abanath, that investment for the church pension fund portfolio, what you see in that is positive returns, which we need, which is a priority for the sustainability of the fund. But when you talk to Daryl, who's the principal of that organization, and you ask him, how do you measure success? He will talk about the financial returns, which he must do. But he also measures the success of what they're doing in the housing market in terms of voter registration, in terms of criminal, in terms of arrest, in terms of number of kids and their school behavior, the amount of kids they serve in after-school programs. So he has a housing investment that delivers strong returns for the fund, but remarkable returns for the community, which is predominantly people of color, where Abanath has its housing. So we do try to develop great relationships with people who are committed to doing good work, not only for the people who are depending on us for benefits, but also for the communities in which they serve.
Thank you, Patty. And just want to point out that we have a series of videos about our socially responsible investing on our YouTube channel, and our recent insights and ideas on investing in economically disadvantaged communities, which you can find at cpg.org. So thank you for that. Okay, moving on to another question we received in the Q&A channel. This question just came in and I open it up to everyone. What do you believe are the implications of Bishop Curry's bold vision for the Episcopal Church for Christian formation, for congregational practice, and for the mission of the Episcopal Church in churches? Who wants to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take.
Yes, please.
As Nathan pointed out, we are lucky to have the presiding bishop that we have, and we also we have to also understand that what he is asking us to do, what he is challenging us to do, might not happen. I think that it's really important that we don't know the answer to that question until we get the Episcopal Church to fully engage in this work, right? The Episcopal Church has done a lot of programming around slogans that lasts 3, 6, maybe even 9 years. And most of us here probably could remember the slogans, but we have no idea what happened to the work. And so what the answer to that question is really on all of us going forward. But also we have to understand that we are part of a denomination that for most of its history did not do this. Most of its history, it did not do this. Just as Glenna told us in the particular history of Epiphany in Washington, D.C., we must understand this is a denomination that always, until the end of the 19th century, supported slavery. This denomination supported slavery when slavery was over. We did not stand up for the way that freed slaves, enslaved people in this country were treated in this country, especially in the South. We did not stand up and say that was wrong. You know, our largest schism in this church was a schism over slavery, right? We have Episcopalians who are descendants of people who left the Episcopal Church to set up the Episcopal Church of the Confederacy. And so we have an internal job of bringing this denomination to a point where we can do this work. And so as much as we spend time speaking to the justice in the communities in which we exist, we must spend that same time speaking to the injustice that has existed in our denomination. And when we put all those pieces together, then we might be able to really answer this question.
If I might just chime in on that, I'm sorry.
No, go
if
ahead,
I could
Bishop.
just chime in on that. one of the greatest challenges in white organizations, that is to say, organizations that have been shaped by and for a white constituency, and most mainline churches, that's the reality, is what blocks us from the beloved community, I think, are two things. One is for those who really care, there is the fear of bearing the burden of guilt. And it drives us either to put very gentle barriers between ourselves and others, or it causes us to show ways in which the good things we have done exempt us from the privilege of the legacies of racism, of classism, and all the other isms. I believe that our presiding bishop, with many others who are working and collaborating with him, are trying to do, and I think Dean Sandye said it, to create the contours, to create the context in which we can begin to have those conversations. Creating that is a way in which there are models and programs and so on that invite us into honest conversation. And with a conversation that says to us that if we speak the truth in love, and that love term, I know that the presiding bishop gets beat up a lot about, every time he shows up, it's about love. But love is not about the warm fuzzy. Agape really means having a godly respect for the other. No matter how they differ, no matter how they have offended, I am going to engage you. I'm going to engage what I may not agree with, but I will do so recognizing that you too are a child of God. That's hard, and that takes deep spiritual development. And the last thing I would say about that is why the church has been pressing so hard and the PB so hard on the spiritual side, that we recognize that we have a tradition of faith and spirituality which can help us to begin to see and respect one another for their humanity and their dignity, which then can give us, hopefully, the courage to get beyond our guilt, get beyond our fear, and just be open and vulnerable to one another.
And what do you think will happen when the next presiding bishop is elected to beloved community?
Well, that's why what we are doing now will be so important. Um, one of the books I use around civil rights is the Beautiful Thing and More Beautiful and Terrible History by Jean Ann Tara Harris. One of the things she talks about is the great man theory of history. And there is a tendency for us not to recognize that the gifts that God gives us, we have to own them, embody them, and live in them. And so then we influence who the next president of the House of Deputies is and how she or he sees things, who the next presiding bishop is, who our next rector will be. As Ella Baker once said, that strong people don't need a strong leader. And I think that if we are going to be nurtured, she was the founder of SNCC, so she was really quite the rabble rouser, but she was right. If we can grow in this time and use this as a time to nurture and to embrace and take the opportunity to get to know each other and to share the vision, we'll be all right, whomever is elected as presiding bishop or the House of Deputies or our diocesan leaders.
Reverend Sandye, you wanted to speak?
I did. I want to piggyback on Bishop Baxter's words to also say that we are 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour in American life. As much as we don't want to acknowledge that, that is real. And what Bishop Curry has been leading us to is not necessarily a set of programs, but inviting us, as Bishop Baxter said, to a spiritual journey. And it has moved us in some ways from the facile reality of our faith into recognizing that bearing the cross is hard work. And suddenly we are being asked to do work that is more work than joining the country club. And it's saying that this is a church that is going to make requirements of us in order for us to live into who we claim to be, to have the moral courage to be in right relationship with one another, even when it's difficult. And for those of us who've been accustomed to faith being easy, to it being a wonderful place to show up on Sunday morning and to be with your friends and to enjoy them, you know, the question becomes, what do you do when the person comes through the door who's not one of your friends and is not someone you know and maybe doesn't look like you do and maybe doesn't smell right and may have a mental illness? You know, how do you recognize and see God in them and help the community into which they've come see God in them so that they are welcomed as a beloved child of God? And it seems to me that we've got to, we've got to really wrestle with that, because we are still siloed in our worship times. And we're often siloed only with people like ourselves. And until we can break that down and recognize what Archbishop Temple meant when he said the church is the only institution that exists for those who have not yet come through its doors, then we'll be more of a club than we are of a church. And I know that that's stepping on toes, but if we're going to speak the truth in love, we have to speak that truth and live that truth.
Thank you.
In a point in the early church that gets described in Acts, right? Christian preachers have come to a town, and people say, "Oh, those are the people who want to turn the world upside down." Now, when last have you heard that described of Episcopalians? Those are the people who want to turn the world upside down.
Okay, Mother Huber, and then Patty.
Well, I just want to remind us that this didn't just start when Presiding Bishop Curry was elected presiding bishop, right? We've been on the, he was doing this work before he was presiding bishop. He was doing this work when he was a young man as an Episcopalian. And so the work will not stop when Presiding Bishop Curry is no longer presiding bishop. It may not look the same on a macro level, but we will continue on a micro level doing this work, creating pathways for others so that we can move closer to being beloved community.
Thank you. Thank you. Patty?
I was going to say something similar. I mean, it has been such a wonderful gift to the church that the presiding bishop has been so focused on this with the just triumphant support of Stephanie Spellers, whose name I just want to put in this conversation. But it was my understanding, I was at the General Convention when he was elected, that this was a conversation that the church was having or trying to start having all along or at that moment. And the Episcopal Church is part of, obviously, the broader world in which we live. And this is a conversation that must be had right now. Everywhere you look, people are in the middle of trying to figure out racial reconciliation. So even though I think Bishop Curry has done just a profound job of jumpstarting this conversation, and his leadership has been profound in this area, but the people of the church are hungry for this now. And some of the work of CPG is the result of people in the church demanding that we understand the truth. So I'm going to have faith in the people of the church to continue this conversation in some way, even after the presiding bishop is no longer the presiding bishop. So I remain hopeful.
Thank you. Okay, panelists, I would like to shift gears slightly and talk a little bit about the environment today, after the murder of George Floyd and too many other unarmed Black people and the social unrest that followed. I've spent a great deal of time speaking with my colleagues who are involved in our People of African Descent Affinity Group about allyship how to be an ally, how to be receptive to offers of allyship. And so my question is for everyone. Would you please describe for us what allyship means to you and how you think someone can be the most effective ally?
I think when we're talking about allyship, when it comes to race in this country, it really is important that we're not using the word ally like we use it in diplomacy, where we have a where we have a meeting and we say, okay, what do I get out of this? And you say, what do I get out of this? And we sign a treaty and we become allies until we decide not to be allies. Right? And you can see that in the world all the time. I think we need to be talking about allyship in terms of how we perceive in our lives and communities race. And most of the people on this panel, all of the people on this panel, right, before before an hour or two goes by in their daily lives, think about race. All of us do. Something happens or something that we need to do or some decision we have to make, and we think about race. We think about us as people of color in a world that immediately seems not to be people of color in the majority. And what I want is for white people to wake up and think about race. See, I want people, if we talk about allies, we're talking about people who we are convinced are as concerned about this as we are, that it is not a hobby, that it is not occasional, that they are concerned about this as we are. I know no Black person that goes to a meeting that when they get out, if they're asked, could not tell you how many Black people were in that meeting. None, right? They all know that. But I want white people to do the same thing, walk out of that meeting and say there were 10 white people and 2 Black people in that meeting. See, I want them to think about race daily. And then I can have a conversation. We can talk because we're not starting from trying to convince you that there is racism, right? We're starting from a conversation of yes, and how do we, both of us, deal in that world, right? What do we do? White people do not need Black people to find out what racism is.
Indeed. Mother Huber.
I would just add to what Honorable Rushing said is folks will say, well, you know, this particular issue is not about race. But in America, it's always about race. And that is my initial response to someone who's like, okay, but you know, some things are really not about race. No, when I walked into the room, you saw a Black woman of a particular social class. It is always about race. And to not be threatened by that, that's a truth. It just is. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person or you're not a good Christian or you failed at being an Episcopalian. It just is. And that is part and parcel of living in this country and being willing to unpack and absorb what all of that means without feeling threatened and shamed and wallowing in the guilt. That's a starting point.
I'd like to pick up on that guilt piece. I mentioned that earlier, and I, in my limited experience, that's been a driver, the guilt and then the denial that comes about. And so allyship cannot be about having a Black friend or having a relationship with someone that will help to assuage either my guilt about the history that I bring or about my privilege. But I want to stress just quickly 2 other things that I think are important. The survival of people of color in a corporate structure is one in which we bear the burden not only of doing our job, and I've had some fairly high profile positions, but it has to do with an unstated goal or obligation. Your presence proves we're not racist or a racist institution. And so therefore, when we try to address the issues, and I know women who have been put into these kinds of highly visible situations also understand this. When you try to address racism or sexism or homophobia, then there is this pushback that sometimes can diminish all the other positive things you have done because you violated a very important, at least early in your tenure, you have violated a very important reason why you are there. Now that may not be a conscious kind of thing, and sometimes it is. So we bear that burden of how do you go about doing the work that is been given to you in the position description and all of that, and at the same time navigate the fact that you are there to show that this institution, this organization, this community is not racist. The second thing I wanted to say on this is surviving in the workplace. There are two resources. One is a little essay called Surviving Workplace Whiteness, a guide by Amber Cabral. She is wonderful, and she is an inclusion strategist and a life coach and an author. And it's a very, very short article. I hope Blacks and whites will read it because it really talks about how does Nathan as a person of color survive? And it can also be read by a white person who wants to be more open and supportive of a colleague of color. So I think that resources like that, there are many others out there, that's just simply one that I'm aware of. But that allyship is one thing, but another piece is how do we survive and what is the interest that others may have in helping us to survive and truly be a colleague, not a friend, but a colleague for the interest of the individual and the interest of the organization's mission.
Thank you, Bishop. That, it makes me think there's often a line we straddle between opening ourselves up enough to make connections with potential allies and being hesitant to reveal too much of the pain we feel as victims of institutional and interpersonal racism. Revealing too much often makes our white colleagues feel defensive or that we're blaming them. Have any of you encountered instances of white fragility, and how have you managed those situations?
I think
all of us have encountered instances.
Exactly. I wanted to say we've all encountered it, and I think that first of all, we're not victims. We are the recipients of some pretty awful things at work, but we're not victims. I want to maintain that we have a victorious spirit, even in the midst of microaggressions and injustice. Opening up ourselves to our colleagues sometimes evokes guilt and shame in them, but it also often can be used as a weapon against us in the future. And that is, I think, a very scary thing. How much am I willing to reveal of myself to develop a friendship, a colleagueship, as the bishop said, and how much do I need to keep to myself in order to survive? My experience has been that there always comes a moment when, whether it's meant or not, by action or by words, you are told that you are the N-word, either by action or by inaction, either by what they've done or what they've left undone. That's what you're told, no matter how close you are to folks. And that part of our survival in this society has been to learn how to navigate that and how to recognize that when it comes, we're not destroyed by it, because we recognize that that is a piece of our reality. And you shake the dust off your feet and you figure out how to go forward, but you also recognize that you're not going to turn your back on that person again. And that is, that is a critical piece that I think so many of us learn at home before we go out into the world. And then when we haven't learned it, it becomes a shock when we experience it. But it is a reality. Saying that does not mean that there is no hope. It simply is saying that that is the reality with which we deal. The allies among us, the folks who really do want to take this journey with us, are people who, when that happens, when they fall into that pit, are able to acknowledge it and own it, and we're able to have the moral courage together to go forward. So we have to not live in this nefarious world where we think all will be bright because people have been allies with us, but to recognize that when we hit those speed bumps, if we've made a commitment, a covenant to do this work, that we'll be able to talk it through, work it through, get to the other side, and continue the journey, which is a journey and not a program.
Thank you.
I think Sandye is so right. I think that we should not confuse hope with optimism. See,
Right.
Hope assumes that there is bad. As Barbara Harris used to always tell us, we have to remember that we are called to be an Easter people in a Good Friday world. And if we pretend Good Friday didn't happen, then we need to get another religion.
That's right. Amen.
I would also add to the conversation that when we talk about white fragility, it's not just an interpersonal conversation, right? It's also institutional. And some of that is looking at what job opportunities there are for people of color and who's in what positions. So at one point, it was easier for a Black person to be bishop than a cardinal rector. And I would not say that that has shifted. How many years was it between Bishop Gail Harris and Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burroughs, right? These are, and now if we look at the House of Bishops, how many Black men or men of color do we see occupying those spaces? There's white fragility in our institutions and how we hire and promote people of color.
Kim Toya, I wanted to piggyback on that because it's in our institutions, and we don't want to have to face into it. But if we go back to fragility, we all have the same blood, we all have the same organs inside of us, we all have the same hearts that will be broken, and yet we don't have the same skin color. And yet when you look at lynchings of the past and modern day lynchings with James Crow Esquire, who no longer wears a white robe but wears a pinstripe suit, there ought to be a lot of Black fragility. Okay? There ought to be a lot of Black fragility for the ways in which we have been destroyed by privilege. And we happen to be fairly resilient. And so when we talk about the things that are difficult, our white colleagues are talking about their fragility, but I would like us to look in a holistic way at our general fragility, for we live in a post-traumatic stress disordered society, and everybody is fragile. And so to point out one bit of fragility over another because we're trying to speak truth, it seems to me becomes disingenuous because it's touching all of us.
If I can jump in, I guess I want to share to my colleagues at CPG who are watching, but anyone else, if this is helpful, sort of my walk. And I actually believe that it is my job at CPG to show up 100%. I bring my whole self to work every single day. And I show up with love, and I show up with bravery, and I show up whole. And so there are times when I do have to point out to my colleagues that something has happened that reveals racial bias. And I do it with love, and I will share. And for the most part, people have received that well. There is white fragility everywhere, but I don't let that white fragility change the strength that I need or have when I enter every conversation and every meeting. And what I need allies to do at work and elsewhere is to enter spaces of learning and try to be quiet and open in those spaces. If I hear you proclaiming yourself as an ally, that is the first indication that you have work to do, as far as I'm concerned. So for me, the best allies are the ones that are silent and listening and open in groups of Black people, but vocal and courageous in groups of white people. We need allies who are more active, even with their tears, when we are not in the room. But that their tears and their words, when we are in the room, sometimes feel very heavy on us, because we are trying to be firm and strong and great amid the burden of race. And that is a heavy burden to carry. And we don't have the strength to carry your guilt too. So we understand it. I want to honor and respect it. But those conversations need to happen with your white colleagues. And so anyone who is listening, wondering how they can help, it is participating in events like this, but talk about this with some of the white people that you know, and ask them and yourself why some of the things we're talking about are true. Put on your cape and be an ally when you are surrounded by people who look like you and not like us, because that is the help that I feel we need right now. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes left. I want to try to get a couple of more questions in. Mother Huber, you wanted to say something brief?
Yes, I just wanted to remind our listeners that Black people, people of color, we're not a monolith either,
Precisely.
right? So we are going to respond from our individual particularities. And that's just a helpful thing to remember as we move forward.
All
And if I
right.
could just chime in one
Of course.
thought on this, and I really agree with what my sisters and brothers have been saying. As Courtwright Davis loves to say, my sisters and brothers of ebony grace. While we really want to see the equality of how we've survived trauma in whatever our racial and national heritage may be, there's also a line that gets drawn, and I think it's a necessary line. This has been ascribed to James Baldwin, this quote that I'll make, and I'll just leave it out there. I think it was really by the son of Baldwin, but in quotes. But he says, we can disagree, because there's a lot of disagreement out there about, alternative facts and my story, your story. But he says, we can disagree and still love each other, have a respect for each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist. There's a line there. And this is not just about being nice. At least it is for me. It is not just about how do I make peace so I can get by. That there is times when we need to say, like my daughter says to this old sexist guy here, and I that's a confession. She makes it clear where the position I'm taking is denying her humanity, her dignity. And I think that is true now that we're talking in this conversation about Black and white conversations, that we as people of African descent have an obligation to state when we see in what is being shared that it is grounded and rooted in oppression and in the denial of our humanity.
I think we have time for one more question that I'd like to direct to Vice President Rushing. as we look toward the 80th General Convention in the summer in Baltimore and reflect on an evolving Episcopal Church. Would you discuss for us where you see the challenges and opportunities for Black people, for other people of color in a predominantly white church?
On one level, I think it's important that Black people understand that they choose to be here, that nobody is making us be here with these white people, and that it is an advantage for us, and it is a missionary advantage for us. And I think Black Episcopalians more and more need to understand that they are missionaries to white Episcopalians. We are asking them to redeem the religion that, as Thurman would say, the master has defiled. And we need to focus going forward in the Episcopal Church, as we have been focused in past conventions. As we have said here, we have to be focused on making this the key piece of the theology of this denomination, and that the beloved community is what we will do and be known for and be known by.
Thank you.
Yes.
I
Yes.
would like to thank everyone for the many, many questions that we received. We could literally have gone on for another hour or two to get through the questions. I just want to say in closing that we did record today's webinar. It will be available on cpg.org/Black Voices, and Jermaine is going to put that in the chat window for everyone. It's also available on our YouTube channel, and we encourage you to share today's webinar with your friends, your family, within your congregation, and it will also be on Facebook Live to share. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists.
And thank you, CPG, both for
Yes.
this and also for the pension.
Indeed,
Very welcome.
indeed.